Good afternoon, and this chilly Saturday afternoon here in British Columbia. And Ron Dart and myself are going to discuss both the St. Sergius and St. Albans, or St. Alban and St. Sergius Society, and the history of the Philokalia a bit, because, as you know, in connection with the British Columbia chapter of the St. Alban and St. Sergius Society, we're discussing the Philokalia, and also inviting people who are interested in the society itself to contact us and inquire more about it and perhaps become involved in this chapter of the organization. The St. Alban and St. Sergius Society was founded primarily for discussions between Orthodox Christians and Anglicans, and to promote some kind of relationship. A lot of people wouldn't be aware that during the Russian Civil War, when Patriarch Tikhon had been arrested by the Soviets and was actually going to be sentenced to death, Metropolitan Anthony Khrapovitsky, who was the Metropolitan of Kiev, but in exile, living in exile in Yugoslavia, had become very close to the then Archbishop of Canterbury, and enlisted the help of the Anglican Church and of several civil governments as well to pressure, to put a stop to the execution of Patriarch Tikhon, and try to take some of the pressure off the church in Russia. And from that time on, while Metropolitan Anthony Khrapovitsky maintained a close friendship with Canterbury, there was always a relationship between the Russian Church and the Church of England. And in many ways, the Church of England served as an outlet for real news of what was going on in the persecution of the Church in Russia. And also applied pressure and tried to get support in the West for the Russian Orthodox Church to help it survive and take at least some of the pressure off the persecution by the various communist regimes, Stalin and Khrushchev. And so this relationship developed partly because of the efforts to save the life of Patriarch Tikhon. But afterwards, it developed into the St. Alban and St. Sergius Society. Ron, you want to give us a little more background on the society itself?
You know, my first interaction with it was when I was at Regent College. I was, as we mentioned before, doing my MA on John Cassian. And the person I was doing it with was Jim Houston. And Jim Houston had studied at Oxford. He became one of the leading geographers there, and then went on to become the first principal of Regent College in 1969. And he'd left being principal of 1979. But when he lived in Oxford, he lived with Nicholas Zernoff for 6 years, from 1947 to 1953. And Nicholas Zernoff was one of the founders of St. Alban and St. Sergius when he came from Russia, as many of the Russians did, fleeing the revolution. Some went to Paris and some went to England, and others went to other places. But so I had many chats with Jim Houston in his study about his 6 years living with Nicholas Zernoff. Jim himself was involved to some degree with St. Albans and St. Sergius, and then Jim was also very involved with C.S. Lewis, and C.S. Lewis published with Sobernost, which was the magazine sponsored by St. Albans and St. Sergius. So the origins of St. Albans and St. Sergius really go back to just after 1917, but there has, as you were mentioning earlier, there has been a long centuries engagement between the Church of England, or Anglicanism, and Orthodoxy, going back to the Oxford movement of the Tractarians, and then back of them to the Caroline Divines, who were very, very interested in Orthodoxy. And any form of Anglican high churchmanship has a great affinity to the Orthodox, because both share the commonality of the fathers and mothers of the East and West as a real font of insight and information. What's very interesting too is that as a result of the Oxford movement, some of the early work done in the desert mothers and fathers came out of the Catholic revival in Anglicanism, and so Benedicta Ward was part of the Sisters of the Love of God. She did some of the primary work on unearthing the aphorisms, the many aphorisms of the Desert Mothers and Fathers. Durwas Chitty came out of that particular tradition. And so some of the finest work in the last century in unearthing the Mothers and Fathers of the Desert has come as a result of that Catholic revival of Anglicanism, which goes back to the Mothers and Fathers, which Orthodox and Anglican share together, and of which St. Alban, St. Sergius is a part.
I think that that work did start fairly early, and the efforts on the part of the Anglican Church in the question of Patriarch Tikhon when he was sentenced to death, of course, made for a stronger bond in the relationship between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Anglican Church. Then developed during the time of Stalin and the time of, particularly the time of Khrushchev as well, when a lot of Anglicans were going to Russia and bearing witness to what was actually going on there, and trying to stir up interest in the West toward, the one university, Kent University, I believe, maintained an archive of what was going on in Russia at the time, and even rated the various bishops by their degree to which they might be compromised with the Soviet state. And so when I think about the St. Alban and St. Sergius Society and the relationship between the Anglicans and the Russian Orthodox, of course the first thing I think about was the efforts to save Patriarch Tikhon. And that was a very valuable contribution that was made by the Anglican Church. Even in getting the British government to join in a public statement, which was then sent to Russia. And the French, American, and British governments all sent a joint letter saying that they would have to withdraw recognition of the Soviet state if they executed Patriarch Tikhon. And that seemed to have had quite an impact at the time. So Patriarch Tikhon was spared a little longer. And that's the kind of experiences from the past that we need to build a kind of relationship on. And we're not speaking here about a particularly ecumenical effort, because ecumenism has a bit of a spotty past and spotty history, and so we wouldn't want to tie it to that particular wagon. We're looking at something else, and that is a friendly discourse and conversation between the Anglican and Orthodox traditions, and not in the way of trying to say, well, we'll all be unified at some point and have administrative unity or even theological unity, because likely it won't happen. But there has to be a groundwork that demonstrates that we are Christians, that we do follow our Lord Jesus Christ. And the basis of that is a mutual respect. And to say that love amongst people who don't agree with each other is perhaps a higher form of love than love amongst those who do agree with each other. So this is these are some of the premises upon which we're journeying, and journeying now into the Philokalia and into some of the other early church writings. And the Philokalia itself is really a collection made of aphorisms and stories from the Egyptian desert, and some from the Palestinian desert, from the early ascetics who were struggling many of them after Christianity became, the state religion of the Roman Empire. And of course, becoming a state religion, there was a lowering of spiritual expectations and of spiritual attainment overall. Not in every case, but overall there was. And these are things that St. John Chrysostom gave voice to and struggled with, and St. Basil the Great, and many of the other great church fathers who were hierarchs of the church gave witness to this lowering of the spiritual life. So in response to that, many of the monks and nuns, or what we would call the desert fathers and mothers, had withdrawn into the desert not as a condemnation of the world, of the created world, but in order to try to retain the spiritual treasures which had been generated in the first 3 centuries of Christianity, and to try to hold on to some of the concepts and ideals of the transformation of the human person. One of the interesting aspects of reading the Philokalia, this collection of aphorisms, sayings, and teachings from the desert, is that it gives us a powerful study of human psychology. And while there were psychologists around already in Hellenic times, not even just Hellenistic times, we see this effort to really penetrate into the soul and the spirit of the human person and into the depths of the mind among the Desert Fathers, which in a way lays a foundation for what we might call clinical psychology, and even for psychiatry to develop upon. And this is one of the great values that's sometimes overlooked in the Philokalia. It's of course written by people who are in the desert, receiving teachings from people who lived in the desert as hermits and sometimes stylites, sometimes in the early Cenobitic monasteries. But how then does this apply to people living in the world today? And how do we extrapolate the explorations of human psychology and the workings of the human soul and the mind, and take it from the desert into the world where most of Christian people live? And how can we apply that, say, in hearing confession, in counseling, in trying to guide our own lives without falling into some disastrous extremism, as some people do? You cannot live and work and raise a family in the world and try to live as if you were living in a cell someplace in the desert. So many of the aspects of the life of the Desert Fathers and Mothers are things that obviously we can't live, but the concepts and the ideas and the discussion of the human person are things that we can use in a very powerful way in our own spiritual journey and in the church itself. And sometimes the church needs renewal. And the renewal doesn't come from looking at things that are novel or experiments that have dawned in the last 100 years, or the last decade, or even the last 1,000 years, but in going back to the most profound spiritual roots, which also are the most profound psychological roots of the faith itself. And that begins with the Desert Fathers and Mothers. And to take from the Philokalia to give us a foundation and a basis for then going outside the desert, outside the Egyptian and Palestinian desert, and finding the other spiritual fathers and mothers who are in other parts of the world and who contributed on the same plane as the Desert Fathers and Mothers. And one of my favorite, of course, is always Hulda, the eldress in Britain, who heard confession from many of the monks and was a great teacher. And there are others too, but founding ourselves on the Philokalia and using it as a foundation to continue, that we might look at things that are common in our traditions and find the spiritual elders and eldresses from Britain, from the Celtic Church, from France, from Gaul, and other parts of the world, certainly the northern Thebaid in Russia. And this is a part of what we're trying to do now, directly connected with the foundations of the British Columbia chapter of the St. Alban and St. Serge, or St. Sergius Society. So we ask you to join us, and those particularly who are here in British Columbia who are interested to contact us and become involved in this society, in this chapter, which we're only just beginning to develop. So Ron, do you want to start with something about the volume 1 of the Philokalia? And I believe Evagrios of Pontus is one of the dominant figures in that volume.
Yeah, very much so. We'll be looking at today book 1. There's 5 books in the Philokalia, and for those who are not aware of it, they really go for almost 1,000 years, from the 4th century up to the 15th. So we're looking at, in some ways, physicians of the soul, people who have reflected deeply, been sensitive to the inner workings of the soul, to how the mind works, how the imagination works, how desires work. And it's interesting that many of these, I think what you're mentioning is absolutely correct, is that how do we take the essence of what you're saying? Because in book one there's 9 particular writers which are being discussed, and the underlying it, which of course crosses whether desert or whether you're in an urban context, or whether you have children, or whether you're married or whether you don't, is underlying is what's called the hesychistic tradition. And hesychia in Greek is very much having that inner spirit of quietness. And in the Philokalia they were called the Neptic Fathers, and the Neptic Fathers comes out of a Greek word nepsis, which means watchfulness, an interior watchfulness. And so in all of these sayings or aphorisms in book 1 of the Philokalia, from Evagrius and Cassian, they have in an appendix Anthony, and there's St. Mark the Ascetic, and there's others, is that often we're not watchful of what's going on inside of us. Thoughts that will come up, feelings that will emerge. There can be negative thoughts, it can be angry, it can be sexual fantasies. And these thoughts can throw us off, and they can lose, often when people are not aware of them, they lose that inner quietness. And so then the inner house of their soul really becomes a boat thrown around on the sea of a variety of things. And so quietness, or the hesychia, is a product of watchfulness. And if a person is not watchful of what's going on with ideas, they can be negative ideas, they can be attacks on people who feel they're not worth much, or they feel insecurity or fears, or ambitiousness. There can be a variety of things. And if a person is not watchful of those, or images, a multiplicity of images which can move through the soul and the mind and the imagination, or unresolved longings or desires that almost an addiction to a variety of objects they turn to, thinking they're going to be fulfilled if they have them, then a person loses that inner peace. And so in the Desert Fathers of Book 1 in the Philokalia, many of their writings are on this peace, or hesychia, is a product of watchfulness. How do we remain watchful to what's going on inside of us? And so all of these little comments or insights, these people were studious, almost so particular. They cross their T's and dot their I's in terms of the inner life and their inner terrain. And so if anyone wants a feel for those who have had antenna for the inner journey, these particular men were attuned to this. Evagrius is one of the first ones. After Evagrius Ponticus, he grew up, he was anyways a shooting star of the patristic era, good friends with Basil, Gregory of Nazianzen, and Constantinople. But he decided at a certain point in his life, for a variety of reasons, unresolved tensions in his own life, which perhaps he could have resolved by staying in an urban context. He ended up going out into the desert and studied with the two Macarius. And then he went on to become a great spiritual director. And of course there's divided opinion on Evagrius in terms of his speculative theology, but in terms of his practical, almost pastoral care for people and being with them and just naming those issues in their life that had to be dealt with, which were stealing their peace. He was quintessentially probably, he was so surgical in terms of his insights at a practical pastoral level, and this is why he was included. And then from him, he became the director to John Cassian in many ways. And Cassian never went in quite the same speculative theological direction Evagrius did, but he still had that in his 24 conferences, that same incisive insights into the nature of human longing, thinking, desire, imaginations, and how do we remain watchful in terms of what's going on. Because if we don't deal with what's going on internally, it will have an implication for how we treat other people in terms of thought, word, and deed. And so, even though the Book 1 in the Philokalia, it tends to be preoccupied with the inner life, there are implications for the outer life if one does not deal adequately with their inner life and things that can be thought, said, and done to others.
Yeah, this is one of the crises. By the way, I know there's something called quietism that some Western writers are quite opposed to. When we think about a hesychasm, then the first thing that should come to our mind is the command, be still and know that I'm God. And that God isn't always in the whirlwind or the earthquake or the thunderstorm, but sometimes a still small voice. And a still small voice cannot be heard by somebody who's making too much noise themselves. So that we have to come to some kind of a peaceful condition where we are still enough inside to hear a still small voice. So to be still and know that I'm God. This is really the credo of hesychasm. When we talk about the inner spiritual life and being wakeful, really nepsis would be being wakeful and keeping guard, being on watch. When people come here to discuss problems, one of the biggest marital problems in our day is becoming addicted to internet pornography. And I have a number of Protestant people who come for confession because they don't have confession in their own churches. And a couple of them have been actually Protestant ministers and have had problems with internet pornography, which starts with a pop-up on the computer. And somehow the pop-up is there to lure you. And you fall for the lure and you go and then you become fascinated or interested. And then all of a sudden people find themselves addicted. There are kind of two aspects to it. One of them is the fact that it's kind of a double whammy because, first of all, people are lured to internet pornography, and for most men, they have no hope of ever attaining any of these women or participating in it, so that adds to their misery because their passions are being roused for something that can never be fulfilled, can never be touched. And the second part of it is one minister who came to me told me once he was having problems with internet pornography, and he talked to his colleagues about it. And of course they don't believe in any kind of inner work or working on yourselves or being wakeful about what's going on inside yourself. Simply like a toggle switch, you turn these things on and off. And they said just surrender it all to God and it'll all go away. And he said after nearly a year I realized that all I was doing was surrendering, that I needed something more. And then we sat down, we talked about the hesychastic tradition, the prayer for the guarding of the mind, in particular the Jesus prayer, and how you have to find some kind of peacefulness and quiet and then go from that to some kind of wakefulness so that you're keeping watch over your soul and over your mind. And then you're actually working on the problem with what we call mental work or interior work. It's all a part of hesychasm. It isn't just sitting, being quiet and repeating prayer over and over, but also to pay attention to what's going on in your mind and the system by which it develops in your mind and how it reaches to your heart. And this is one of the most powerful things that the desert dwellers had done, because when they describe the guarding of the mind and the way a passion develops in the mind, it turns out that they follow almost exactly the pattern of what we now know from neurobiology is actually taking place. But they had discerned this long before. People even knew for sure whether the hegemonicon was in the brain or in the ventrals or where it was in the body, where the senses, the temptations, the thoughts actually occurred. At one time people thought it was in the body and they blamed bodily movements. However, this all takes place in the brain. And it always astonishes me when I read the system of how the stimulus develops according to the fathers and mothers of the desert, and when I follow the same thing through neurobiology and find that we're following the same pattern and even the same general regions of the brain. So when they were studying these things, they paid such careful and detailed attention, and as Ron says, dotting the I's and crossing the T's. They paid such careful and close attention and were so wakeful and so watchful in themselves that they actually discerned the pattern that was taking place in the brain. And they discussed this in a way that's extremely helpful to us, particularly in prayer. And the one little footnote I wanted to add about Evagrius of Pontus, he did actually fall into very real theological heresies. He was a brilliant man, like Origen, and a great struggler in the desert. In the end, he ended up believing in pre-existence of souls and transmigration and even reincarnation. These came from his civil theology, that is the theology he encountered outside the desert. And what it tells us is that we gain a great deal of wisdom, knowledge, and understanding, but we can't take it for granted that anyone is infallible or perfect. One of the most powerful, really spiritual psychologists that we have in the history of the church is Evagrius of Pontus. And his chapters on prayer are something really to study very carefully. And we're going to be posting on the upcoming website for the St. Alban's and Sergius Society a kind of a blog discussion of how we apply these things in our own secular civil life. And we'll find that Evagrius, in his chapters on prayer, will be contributing a huge amount to our understanding and knowledge. Like St. Isaiah, who also appears in, I believe, the first volume of the Philokalia, and defines the categories of anger in a way that we can take hold of and really apply in our own struggle. But struggle is one of the key words. An inner human struggle for transformation of the inner person, which does not happen magically. It happens by our cooperation with divine grace and by our own efforts through prayer and through contemplation and with the grace of the Holy Spirit to acquire this wakeful quietness within us that makes it possible for us to actually come into contact with our own inner person, with the realities of our own humanity and the realities of our own personhood, and really to begin to know ourselves in a way that helps us advance our spiritual life and our inner human relations. So it's not some kind of abstraction for people living in some isolated circumstances, but something that impacts on every aspect of our spiritual life, but also can profoundly affect our social life and the way we deal with the world around us and our inner human actions, responses, attitudes that actually help us approach these things in a truly Christian manner and in a more peaceful manner. And this is one of the real values of the Philokalia when we take it and study these concepts that we want to take and apply to the life of people living in the world in the 21st century.
I was thinking too, when we think of Evagrius, you have quite an interest in axial periods, and you've done previous discussions on the first axial period. In many ways we can consider the patristic period the second great axial period because it was a very cosmopolitan area, and one of the writers in book one of the Philokalia, he's been getting letters from India, and you have contemplatives in India are asking the desert, some of the desert fathers, how do I go deeper in my prayer life? How do I achieve the state of inner quietness and watchfulness? And watchfulness isn't just for the negative things that could come up, it's being watchful for the overtures of divine love and how God is trying to speak to us. If I could use a parable even of the throwing the seeds into the soil. Really the Philokalia is about cultivating the soil of our soul, so when the seeds of the divine are thrown into it, there's not brambles and thorns and rocks, but in fact they find good ground. And in certainly the Christian tradition, we use the language of synergism, in which there's divine grace, there's God's goodness coming to us, but there's also our preparation, our watchfulness, our attentiveness, our openness, our receptivity to the overtures of God's love in it. So that state of hesychism and watchfulness is being attentive to the negative things which may pull us over a cliff for our soul. It's also being watchful for the very path the divine path we can walk to deification. And so watchfulness is a negative and a positive side, and to the degree the soil of our soul is properly cultivated, we will be transformed in that best sense of deification. And so these whole desert mothers and fathers, and in book 1 of the Philokalia, it had spread out beyond Palestine, Syria, and Egypt, and as I was mentioning, one of the writers in book 1, he's having requests come to him about how do I go deeper in the contemplative life, and how do I make sense of this? You are the people who've you've dived deep, you've got the pearls of your new being in Christ. How do we go further in this? So there is this interesting interaction between India going on at the time. And this is some of the earliest records we have, in fact, between India and Christians in India and the Christians in the desert. I might also say Philokalia, which I find interesting. Philia is a Greek word that's not only love, but it's people together.
Yeah. Well, actually, philanthropos really means man to be the friend of mankind.
Sure, yes.
And the Philokalia is we sometimes translate it as love of the good or love of the beautiful, but it's to embrace the love. Friendship is more embracing than just love can be still with space, but friendship, not the way we use it in modern English, of course, but friendship is more embracing. And the idea is to embrace the beautiful and to embrace the good. And not just to, I can love it from the distance, but to be a friend with it, I have to be close. I have to be intimate. And it's an intimacy with that, with the good, the beautiful. And sometimes that is missed a little bit in the fact that we love something doesn't necessarily mean that we embrace it. And we're really called to embrace these things. The parable that Christ gave about the seeds falling among the thorns, falling on the stones or on the dry ground, I often think about the inner human struggle with that, because when we were kids on the farm, we used to have to pick up the stones out of the field. And we had what was called a stone boat, kind of a sledge that was pulled on and throw the rocks on it. And we used to say that all summer we pick up the rocks, all winter the devil pushes more up, because somehow the frost would always heave more rocks up. And when you think about the seed falling among the thorns and falling among the rocks, it is possible to pick the rocks up and to pull the thorn bushes out. But that takes inner work. And that's part of mental work, and part of hesychasm too, is to pick those stones up and pull the brambles out. We're sort of like being gardeners who go into the garden of the soul and prepare the soil and pull up the weeds and make sure the seeds are planted properly, that we're actually tending to the garden of the soul and in our prayer life, in our hesychastic life, and really making the ground ready for what God himself is going to plant, for the seeds that are going to come into that soil from the grace of the Holy Spirit. And that's part of inner watchfulness. So it isn't what some people would refer to as quietism, where you sit and don't do anything or you simply meditate. You're actually carrying on a constant work within your soul, within your heart, within your mind, to receive and be aware of and to be watchful for the things that God has promised to bestow, so that when they actually come, they don't fall on stones in our heart or brambles and weeds that have grown up in our soul, in our minds, and that we have prepared the soil for it. This is really a great part of what hesychastic struggle and the desert dwellers were actually doing.
Yes, I think in that sense, quietism is the counterfeit of hesychism, isn't it? And they can seem to be similar, but in fact they're very, very different. One is a form of interior attempt to be still, but I am not engaged at all in responding to God's love. Whereas hesychism and the whole tradition of the Neptic Fathers is, in fact, there is a struggle going on between my false and my true self, and I have to know the difference, and through the Spirit. And interesting, Philokalia is, again, it's not about me individually doing it, but philia is a Greek word for people together working through it. And so there's some forms of Protestantism almost coming out of the Pilgrim's Progress tradition of Bunyan, that I go off, on this journey and pilgrimage myself to know God, and I leave family and friends behind. But philia, as soon as you see the word philia, it means we're together in being transformed as a people, and there's a communal sense to our transformation.
Yeah, there has to be. That's why some of the Desert Fathers said one Christian is no Christian. Because alone you can fall in love with yourself, but you can't necessarily fulfill the commandments of Christ to have love amongst yourself, have love one for another. Christ never gives us a commandment which is independent of other people or of the community. When Christ says, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments, let's see what the commandments of Christ are. They're about your relationship with other people and with God. But they're always about interhuman relationships. And this is perhaps what happens, that, and I don't want to be too condemnatory or anything like that, but so much of modern Protestantism has fallen into pure entertainment and planning for, training church planners to plan in a business way about how to attract more people. And I recently read an article on the movement within the evangelical megachurches, how to get more money out of the people, because people aren't donating as much anymore. And so you want to get people to donate more. So you set this up on a business premise now. And you lure people into the church by entertainment. The minister will start down to wear blue jeans, maybe a little bit low on his hips, even though he's far too old for it, because he thinks it'll look like the hip generation of today, or different techniques like this. And there's a great deal of hyper-emotionalism in it. I was in the waiting room at the doctor's office, and of all things to come on with Jerry Springer. Well, you know Jerry Springer's reputation. And then I went to the YouTube and I was watching modern Protestant, I can't even call it a worship service, it isn't. And you couldn't tell the difference between Jerry Springer and the Protestant church. There was no difference whatsoever. It was all of the, waving the arms, this and Yahoo, wah, 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 and all that. It was all the same thing. And Jerry Springer was playing the audience the same way the Protestant minister plays the audience. So it's no longer a congregation of worship. It's the preacher playing the audience. And it's devoid of any kind of spiritual content whatsoever. It's emotional substitute for spiritual life.
Yeah, it's really...
And it's complete unwakefulness.
Yeah, very much so. It's very much reduced to an entertainment industry.
It is. It's based on the entertainment industry.
Yeah, and he or she who gets the most numbers is the most successful.
Yeah.
And of course, quantity is no guarantee of quality, and people who have, I think, even minimal depth can see through the charade of that sort of silliness of which it is. I was going to say also the thing about the Philokalia. There's a tendency today in our culture to separate spirituality from theology, or spirituality from the church, or spirituality from the creeds, or spirituality from liturgy, as if these are oppressive, and my personal experience is everything. The desert, the Philokalia, obviously the time that it's emerging, the creeds are emerging at this time, canons are emerging, the sophisticated theology, a rich view of the church. But many of these particular writers and thinkers on spirituality, they weren't contra theology or contra church or contra synods, or they were asking, because in many ways these are the maps which are offered to us, and spirituality, okay, now we have the map, let's get on with the journey. To have a map without the journey is a form of indulgence. To go on a journey with no map, you can go higgledy-piggledy in all sorts of directions, and people can lose their way on the spiritual journey. And we can all, I'm sure, tell stories of those who, with the best of intentions head off, but they have no sense of the trails to take, the road signs, the markings. And that's what good theology, that's what good creeds give us. But people have to also get on the journey that these particular, this guidance gives us. And so it's sort of translating all of the best of the theology and ecclesiology and creeds into say, okay, you can't sit around and just look at the maps. You've got to get on with the journey. And so how you bring together good mystical theology grounded in a healthy ecclesiology, which is then engaged meaningfully in the public realm in justice and peace and ecological conditions for our age.
Yeah, that's one of the aspects of it that probably been a bit of a tragedy, because spirituality without theology eventually collapses into delusion, because it doesn't have a framework of anything. So you can be led in every possible direction, even into some kind of insanity if you're not careful. But theology without the spiritual life, the inner spiritual life, without spirituality, is also just a meaningless philosophy, because it has to be put into practice. And how it's put into practice obviously has to deal with the inner person, the transformation of the inner person. And you do that within the framework of the community. And of course the sweet mystery of the parish is that that's where you really have to struggle to learn to love your neighbor as yourself. That's your testing ground, to have love amongst yourself, to have love one for another. But at the same time, the direction and the map of the spiritual journey and of the spiritual development and transformation of the inner person is a communal map. It's not an individual treasure hunt map. It actually is something of the community itself, and it never separates or takes one out of the community. It's something that's done in the framework of the theology of the church, in a way that helps to give life and vitality to the theology. And they're mutually dependent, really.
Yes, it's interesting too, when the word parish, the parish comes from a Latin word which comes from the Greek word para oikos.
Mm-hmm.
And oikos in Greek means home, and para is just that which surrounds the home. So in fact, it's in the context of your extended family or your parish
Exactly.
that in fact the mirror is held up to your spirit. And those who run from, in one sense, the spiritual discipline of parochial life are running from the very means of transformation.
Right. And the reason we use the word economia and keeping the house in order. And it's something that is applied for the sake of the household. And we say the economy of Christ, the economy of God. For the sake of the household, he's incarnate and gives shape and form to the household. And we use that word economy, as they say economy in English, but economia is of the household, the keeping of the household. It's very important to remember that. And I think we've kind of come to the end of what we'll broadcast today. So do you want to say anything in summary? I think next time we'll actually look at the exploration of anger, the degrees of anger, and some of the advice that Evagrios gives us specifically in prayer to keep our focus and actually accomplish what it is we set out to accomplish in it. But
yeah, I think it's important because some people will read the Philokalia out of context of the theology or the foundation stones that hold that edifice of spiritual disciplines together. And so when we separate them, we distort very much what they're up to. And people then can slip into a lot of spirituality, if not grounded, could be a form of a veiled narcissism in some ways. And so, yeah, certainly anger. I mean, there's so many particular things which can lead people down rabbit trails in their spiritual journey. And often anger can be veiled, too, in a variety of subtle ways. And Evagrius, as a physician of the soul who worked with many, as it were, patients on the road to recovery and health, he knew how to be there for them And book one, certainly in the Philokalia, deals a lot with anger, its crude forms, its subtle forms, the way it can be used to manipulate people. And he can put his hand very firmly yet tenderly on those places and illuminate for any of us the way things like anger can work themselves out.
Yeah, the way we justify anger as being righteous, when in fact it's just conceit. And because righteous anger has no malice, and it's not directed at people. It's directed at our own, well, perhaps at the devil, perhaps at the things that torment us inwardly. But the kind of anger that has malice or is toward other people is really a form of conceit, and he says that, as a matter of fact. But anyway, we'll continue with that, and again, we welcome anyone interested in the society. The website will be online certainly by the end of next week, and perhaps before that. And we'll then be soliciting contributions to the blog sections of the website. And we thank you all for your attention and for being a little bit niptic about what we're saying here, a little bit watchful and wakeful. And we remember on the bridegroom services, on the first 3 Sundays of Great Lent, when we say, behold the bridegroom cometh in the middle of the night, and blessed is the servant whom we shall find watchful. But the one who's not watchful will be cast out. And come and join us and experience really the meaning of Philokalia, to be a friend of the beautiful, to be a friend of the good in the spiritual life. Thank you, and we ask for your prayers. God bless you, and please join us again.